Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to do a collection review because I was contacted by the company called Snupps, and this is in fact a company which runs a form of social media platform for collectors. So it's an application effectively that one can upload photographs of one's collection to effectively share with the world, which is a curious and novel thought, and I was rather interested when I was contacted by them to do a review of their co-founder's watch collection. And I haven't made one of these collection reviews in rather a while, but I must say this is rather an interesting collection because it's driven very much by design and the style of the watches, which is an interesting contrast to the way we watch collectors often do buy watches, by their technical prowess, which again can lead to somewhat disjointed collections such as mine, which is very much a confused collection, whereas it's interesting to see a collection which is very, very closely and carefully organised. At the end of this review, I will also talk about a couple of other watches I've seen on the Snupps app, which I found particularly interesting and I think are two spectacular horological pieces to really be ignored. Now the first watch in this collection, which I'd like to talk about, is a Breitling Chronomat 7808. And this is a watch which was initially released in 1973, and is a very interesting model because it's one of the very last of that original Chronomat format, which was very similar to the Navitimer. Of course, in truth, the Chronomat actually predates the Navitimer from the 1940s, and was really the precursor in its original form to the Navitimer, which was a more complex version. But I must say, I think the beauty of this watch is in its era. This watch is very much a watch of that 1970s era in terms of styling, from the hands to the orange second hand, to the general colour scheme of the watch. It really does say 1970s, but while remaining very elegant in its way. Now, the movement inside this watch is a Veljoux 7740, which is a manually wound chronograph movement from the era. And what I do like about these older Veljoux movements is that they actually were tricompacts, but in the more traditional arrangement of having them placed on the second bottom half of the dial in that V orientation. Of course, as I've said, this watch is one of the last of the Chronomats to feature that Navitimer style of slide rule bezel, because this was one of the last models before Breitling went bust in the 70s, and then when it was re-established, the Chronomat was a very different model with an external bezel. So it's beautiful to see a watch which has such pedigree in a curious way. To sum up this watch, really, I have to say this is a watch which is superbly of its time in really all the best ways, as a really beautiful sports watch. The next watch in this collection, and following in that trend of pilots' chronographs, is a very different approach from Breguet, which is the Breguet Type 20 Transatlantique, so the transatlantic, which is the date version of the Type 20. And it truly is a watch which, as you know from some of my previous videos, is a watch which I really do respect a great deal for what it did in terms of the pilot's watch world, as a true military instrument, although these days, of course, they are more luxury goods. Of course, where the Breitling is known for its slide rule bezel, the Breguet is known for its flyback chronograph, whereby one can depress the bottom pusher and re-engage the chronograph from a running point without with no interference between these timings. So one's able to time things seamlessly and restart the chronograph instantly, which is a real plus for a pilot, obviously of the era, who needed to time matters of fuel consumption and distance with their chronograph. Where I most respect Breguet, though, is that, and I say this appreciating the fact that the Type 22 and Type 21 are larger, but I appreciate the fact that Breguet have made this watch a 39mm pilot's watch. And in this world of larger watch sizes, it's quite a brave choice for a company to produce a smaller watch. And though they're coming back into fashion, I must say when this watch was released, Breguet really did something quite impressive with this watch. The other aspect of this watch, which I think is a very beautiful element, is the fact that the crystal smooths out straight into that bezel, with an almost seamless split between the two, which gives a beautifully curved top to the watch, and makes it slip under cuffs all the better, which is a real plus for a watch with a bezel like this. Approaching the matter of a pilot's watch from an utterly opposite perspective is the Casio G-Shock 5121. And this is a very large 50mm sports watch, which is, unlike other less expensive G-Shocks, made of steel and resin rather than simply resin. And I think I make no secret of the fact that I personally am not keen on G-Shocks, simply due to the fact that I personally don't like the inelegance of them. I find them too bulky and simply don't suit me, but that very much is my opinion. But certainly they do offer a great deal of features for the price, where this watch is effectively solar-powered, as well as being shock-resistant, 200 meters water-resistant, has a date, a world time, a chronograph, and an alarm, which are features which one couldn't get on a mechanical watch really at pretty much any price, with the resilience of this watch. Though, of course, 50mm is truly an enormous size. I do feel that with G-Shocks, the proof of the product is very much in the fact that these watches are worn in every field, from being worn by pilots to divers, and in many fields they have replaced the mechanical watches which would have sat in their place in the past. So I must say I do respect G-Shocks, but personally this isn't a watch for me. Now the next chronograph, however, very much is up my street in terms of design. And this is a spectacularly bright red dial Tudor Tiger 79270. And this is effectively Tudor's answer back in the day to the Rolex Daytona. But I must say I like certain aspects about this in a strange way more than the Rolex Daytona, because I feel that in terms of general elegance this watch beats the Daytona of the era. And the Daytona of the era had a very broad tachymetric bezel, which was the one thing I never cared for, so I appreciate the fact that this Tudor doesn't have that, but rather has a GMT bezel, which does allow the assistance to the wearer when passing between time zones, which is something which actually I, having several watches with GMT-style bezels, use very often. I can certainly understand why someone would want a watch with one of these. Of course, the watch is a chronograph, and from the orientation and layout of the watch, you can tell it's a Vogel 7750-based movement, which is, of course, an automatic movement, and the case is a fully polished 40mm oyster-style case, with screw-down pushers and screw-down crown with crown guards. One other aspect I rather like about this watch is the manner in which the numerals have been painted on the dial, whereby one has a white finish underneath them, and at a slight angle from that white backing, one has the black numerals painted, which gives an element of depth to the dial which one wouldn't have otherwise, and I think adds a certain playfulness that Tudor have become known for, making slightly less serious watches than Rolex. As a final note on this watch, I can't help but say this after this year's Baselworld releases from Tudor, that I would have liked to see a chronograph like this one from Tudor rather than their Black Bay chronograph, which I don't think anyone really felt quite worked. But I must say this is a wonderful watch and a very attractive piece from Tudor's past. Now the next watch on this list is a bit of an oddity from Tag Heuer, and this is a Heuer Monaco CS211. And this is a curious watch because it's a 36mm Monaco, and of course it is slightly larger at the corners due to the square shape of the watch, but intrinsically it is a rather small Monaco, and I think this suits the watch very, very well because of course it is a vintage-styled watch at its core, making this Monaco very true to that original style, whereby watches were far more moderately sized, carefully sized, more delicately sized generally, and I think this plays off very well on this monochromatic Heuer. And of course the Monaco is often known for bright colours, whereas this one approaches it from a far more dressy perspective, from a monochromatic style where one simply has black, white, and of course the silver aspects of the steel aspects on the dial, notably the indices around the dial, as well as those beautiful hands. Otherwise, this watch does feature a very standard Monaco style, but a very traditional Monaco style, while having enlarged numerals and indices on the dial, with two square subdials and a third circular one at the bottom, with the date integrated into that, which, due to the monochromatic nature of this watch, actually makes it blend in rather well, which is something a lot of people complain about, where dates are too conspicuous, whereas here I think Tag Heuer have really performed very well in hiding that. Of course, the crystal is, in my opinion, the nicest aspect about this watch, and the crystal is this box crystal in this square format, which sits very proud of the case, and I think perfectly frames that dial, to give it again that retro aspect that this watch is appealing to. Now, one watch in the collection which I like the design of, but I personally wouldn't own, is this Momo Design MD064. And this is an ETA quartz powered chronograph from the Italian design company Momo, who design these effectively motorsports accessories such as helmets for racing drivers and aficionados alike. And I must say I rather like some of their designs, but personally I'm not keen on quartz chronographs of this type. Though I must say I do respect the design of this watch as being a very carefully conceived model. It personally isn't a watch which I would consider buying, simply because I find that I wouldn't really want to spend a great deal of money on a quartz chronograph. That said, though, if one looks at the watch from a non-watch background, if you will, and more from a design background, Momo are a truly legendary design company in terms of automotive designs, and in that respect, they are really very reputable in their design and the technology which they put into their designs. Now, at this point in the review, we move towards the dress watches in the collection, and in this case, we have the Cartier Tank Française, or the French tank, if you will. And this is effectively a redesigned tank with broader lugs and a more squared-off case design, though this retains the cabochon on the crown and the various touches that Cartier have always put on their watches. This becomes an altogether more sporty aspect of the tank. And some may say, oh, well, the Santos is the more sporty aspect of a tank, but not so, because I do feel that the tank itself is a very separate model from the Santos, and they shouldn't really be compared. To match this larger, more masculine case comes a metal bracelet, a steel and gold in this case, two-tone bracelet, which also follows the Cartier style of that particular aesthetic, and I think complements the case very nicely to give a more rounded package really than this watch would be on a leather strap. The watch has an interesting dial because it doesn't reach quite the edges of the squared off opening, if you will, the squared off crystal on the front of the watch, but rather the dial remains a sort of a shape within that external square. And of course one has the traditional blued hands that one often sees on Cartier tanks. And of course this watch, in terms of its dimensions, does mean the hands are rather small because the watch is 28 by 35 millimeters. In terms of the movement in this watch, we have rather a curious one, because in this case it's a chronograph movement, but with a layout which is really not seen on any other watches. And it has a tricompax layout, but with one sub-dial at the 12 o'clock, and then two smaller ones around the bottom of the dial. And this is a quartz chronograph movement from Cartier due to the size of this watch, being, as it is, 28 by 35 millimeters. But we also have the date on that upper chronograph, or simple sub-dial in this case. But then the bottom hands have the minutes and the hours of that chronograph. Now, remaining with Cartier, this is a Cartier tank cintré, or the Curvex, as it was known elsewhere. And this is a greatly stretched version of the tank. And this does remind me of the tank Américaine, which was the tank American, which also had a similarly stretched case. But the Curvex really does take this watch to a different level in terms of the elongation and adjustment of this watch. Also, it's worth pointing out that the entire watch curves, making it very difficult to fit a movement inside this watch. The whole watch does in fact curve around the wrist, rather than being a simple flat slab due to the fact that this will be uncomfortable on the wrist. Now, this particular model is in 18 karat gold, which is, I believe, the most traditional material for a tank. But this watch was actually released much earlier than this particular watch, which was produced in the 50s. But the watch was originally released in, I believe, 1921, or around that period, in those first 2 or 3 years of the 1920s, as an alternative to the normal tank, a larger alternative for the larger wristed. And it certainly has held up as far as design goes, and is still a beautiful model in the Cartier lineup, with that greatly stretched dial, which does remind me of many Cartier models where that squared off, in this case rectangular, minute track is elongated to still function with those short hands. Of course, this watch also has that customary cabochon on the small crown placed on the side of the watch, which again is a reference back to the original Cartier tanks, which were of course much more rounded than this watch, but still have a very different aesthetic, and and though they share traits in common, is a very, very different beast. Next we have another watch which follows this theme of smaller dress watches, and a theme which I truly do respect, because this watch is the 31 by 43mm watch, and that's 43mm from across its length, not quite lug to lug, but nonetheless quite a small timepiece. And this is the Frank Muller Long Island 18-karat gold. And this is an automatic Swiss watch from Frank Muller with a very Art Deco style to those hands, and also to those numerals on the dial. And I must say, this is a creation which I think looks tremendous. It really has everything going for it in terms of being a sort of modernised Cartier tank in its aesthetics, which I think looks absolutely wonderful. Now, the pièce de résistance of this watch, the most spectacular aspect, must be that guilloché-style dial, which truly does look superb, and I think frames the watch very, very nicely, and matches that concentric style of having that smaller oval style of minute track around the inside of the dial, which changes ever so slightly in size as it goes around, in order to make that beautiful oval which matches that squared case very nicely. By great contrast to these smaller dress watches comes this IWC converted pocket watch. And this is a watch which was originally a pocket watch and houses the original movement, but it has been replaced into a wristwatch case, in this case gold, a gold case. And this gives a fantastic effect because, of course, one has the size of a pocket watch, which is very impressive on the wrist, and also has the quirks of having that porcelain dial, and also that large sub-second counter at 6 o'clock, in addition to those Breguet-style hands, but in a manageable position of being a wristwatch and not having to wear a waistcoat with this watch to necessarily carry it. This next watch is why I believe that Zodiac are a truly interesting brand from the past. Of course, Zodiac do still exist, but these days their brand market share is much smaller than it was in the past, and they're far less well known. And this watch is a steel and gold triple date, a moon phase watch from around 1950. And it is rather a beautiful piece with that circular case, those interesting lugs, and of course that moon phase. In terms of classic complications on a watch, one really can't get any more classic than this timepiece with a pointer date, and that triple date arrangement with the moon phase at 6 o'clock. This watch is textbook dress watch with complications, and I must say I love the design of this watch for it. It's very simple, very well balanced, and with those Dauphine-style hands, it is actually an extremely elegant timepiece. Another interesting detail about this watch is the manner in which this watch has an overly graduated second track, which is something of the past. It's a very classic style, and I think very nicely frames the dial, that beautiful cream-coloured dial, very, very nicely, and divides it very well from that date track around the edge of the dial, to form a very elegant and nicely balanced dress watch. Now, the last two watches in this collection are among my favourites, and this first one is the Zenith Elite HW Chronometer. And this is a manually wound 18-karat gold 36mm dress watch on a very elegant alligator-style strap, which is this soft brown, which I think complements the gold nicely, where I find that often a black strap can look a little bit too harsh against that gold case. But here you have a very complex, yet remarkably understated case, with a complex silver dial with many, many finishes on the various complications that one can see. Now, this is a manually wound watch, and with that aspect of this watch, I do think it's utterly appropriate to have that 50-hour power reserve indicator up at the 130 position. And the balance of this dial is kept very well organised, I think, because the complications are arranged in sort of a triangle on the dial, whereby one has the date directly below that power reserve at 4:30, and then the small seconds at 9 o'clock, leading to a very balanced yet interesting dial, which has a great deal of different finishes, notably the sunburst effect on the edge of that silvered dial, as well as a checkered effect in the centre, which I think complements those understated leaf hands very well. Additionally, the fact that this watch has a plexiglass crystal does help that soft look of gold on a watch with such vintage characteristics, whereas I find sapphire can often look a little bit harsh, especially on gold watches, whereas I think sapphire looks excellent on steel sports watches. On a vintage style gold watch, I think plexiglass is an excellent choice, and this certainly is a very, very beautiful Zenith, and a very different model to the ones which people usually go for, notably the El Primero. Now, the last watch in this collection is rather an interesting one, because it's an Audemars Piguet, but of course, unlike the vast majority of Audemars Piguets, it's not a Royal Oak. And this is their millinery model, which is a 38 by 34mm 18-karat gold wristwatch. And it actually shows the day-date complication, but in a very different way to other watches, and this has two subdials, two eye-shaped subdials, which mirror the shape of that case, which is elongated horizontally rather than vertically. Of course, where this watch differs from other watches in the collection is very much the case shape, which is this rather peculiar oval shape, which leads to having a rather broad strap but a very short lug-to-lug distance, which I think is rather an interesting look and does differentiate this watch from other watches in the same style of these very classically styled white dial 18-karat gold dress watches. Now, with that Audemars Piguet, I shall conclude this review of this collection. However, before I end, I would like to draw some attention to a couple of other watches which I've seen on Snupps of other collectors and owners, which I must say I thought were too good to ignore. So without any further ado, I shall show you a couple more. Now, this watch is an A.Lange on a datograph with a perpetual calendar and a moon phase, and this is a truly fantastic 18-karat gold watch. And though one does see them quite regularly in terms of watch lovers, this doesn't detract at all from the sheer elegance of these watches and also the complication of these timepieces. Of course, they're very, very different to the watches which I've shown in the Snupps co-founders collection, which I must say is a remarkable collection, with some very interesting pieces which I haven't seen before, and I've had to research quite a bit to know more about, and I must admit this, in terms of vintage watches. But I must say I do love these new A.Lange Zoners with these lovely grey dials, and a design which is very much true to this brand. Although I do think the most beautiful aspect of this watch is without a doubt the movement, with a fantastic level of finishing with bevels and truly spectacular levels of detail and quality going into the movements, which are of course visible through that exhibition caseback. Now, the last watch I'd like to talk about, and actually this fellow Maxime Golovkine has a superb collection on Snupps of three very high-end sports and dress watches. But the one which I'd like to talk about is his Breguet Tradition Tourbillon, which is a wonderful creation that's so typical of Breguet, with their particular style and aesthetic, which is really unseen in other brands, with the way they have these beautiful guilloché dials and then these fantastically skeletonized movements, but without removing any of the elegance of a classically correct Breguet. Anyway, I'll end this video here on this superb Breguet. But thank you very much for watching, and do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to enjoy more content in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, over and out.